All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to have to host my colleague, Dr. Elena Borisova. Elena is currently a postdoctoral fellow, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow to be precise, at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. Elena completed a PhD in what we call cultural anthropology here in the US, or social anthropology in the UK at the University of Manchester. And prior to that, she studied anthropology at European University in St. Petersburg. Today, she will be giving a presentation on her book, which came out last year, based off of her doctoral dissertation research. This book, Paradoxes of Migration in Tajikistan, Locating the Good Life, offers an in-depth ethnographic account of everyday lives amid mobilities between Central Asia, in this case Tajikistan, and Russia. And since the collapse of the USSR, the migration corridor between post-Soviet Central Asia and Russia is one of the largest and most frequented in the world. But despite that, and despite Tajikistan's status as one of the most migration-dependent economies in the world, this is the first academic monograph to grant attention to this phenomenon. So very, very special for those anthropologists of Central Asia, particularly for research migration. And the book draws from ethnographic fieldwork that Borisova conducted for her PhD between 2017 and 2018 in a small village she anonymizes as Mihnat, which means labor in Tajik, in northern Tajikistan. And this book joins a growing body of scholarship that diverges from more traditional scholarship on migration by focusing on migrant sending communities, and it really explores, if you go to a place where a lot of people leave, what does it tell you about migration? So I could go on and on about the many strengths and the contributions of the book, but I think I'll let Dr. Borisova take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for such warm introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So, yeah, as Mariana mentioned, I'm just going to give a talk today about my book. And I'm going to talk, I don't know, maybe for 50 minutes. And hopefully then we'll have a discussion. So, yes, I will read it, but I'll try to do it in a very friendly way. I will start with ethnography, as we anthropologists usually do. Yes. Marhabo, an English teacher in her early 30s from a mixed Tatar-Uzbek family, took me for a walk around a small town in the Sud province of the Republic of Tajikistan in autumn 2017. Approaching the dilapidated Russian cemetery, she sighed. Look around, Lena. Здесь ничего нет. There is nothing here. I looked around and I saw semi-inhabited Soviet apartment blocks covered with discolored paint, with many of their window panes removed. I knew that there was no running water, gas, or heating there, but people who could not buy their own plots of land and could not move to private houses had to find some creative ways to work through this infrastructural failure. I also saw brand new two-story houses with elaborate balconies and lush apricot trees around them, their shadow providing much-needed shelter from the baking sun, which somehow seemed absent from Marhabo's overview of the town's material outlook. Expecting Marhabo to continue a narrative about post-Soviet decay that I had so many times, I prepared to discuss the process of deurbanization, ruination of infrastructure, and lack of economic opportunities to maintain one's livelihood, which were usually listed as the main reasons, the main drivers of migration, both by people themselves and by academics. However, nothingness took on an unexpected meaning in Marhabo's words. Quote, you can read it there as well, but I'm going to read it out loud. People are still hoping that the living conditions will improve there. But the life here is like this. People are forced to make these toy, ritual celebrations, toy. It's so much money. For example, I'm throwing a circumcision feast for my son, and my mother must buy a bull and gift my whole family with new winter clothes. Where can we find such money? They, she means the government, forbid it, but people still do it. That's why people are running away from it. люди бегут от этого, she said in Russian. In Russia, no one cares. You can do whatever you want. When I was there, I was shocked that everyone just walks by minding their own business. Here you must build a house, you must organize all this toy, you must give birth to children, and in the meantime, your life, it's passing by. Жизнь проходит мимо, she said. And then you have to take care of your elderly parents. What can you do? We respect their opinions here. In Russia, there are many abandoned old people, right? She addressed me. During my fieldwork in 2017, 2019, I encountered many similar accounts of migration as driven by nothingness. Almost everyone I spoke to about their decision to go to Russia in search of work began their answer with "there is nothing here," considering it self-explanatory. When pushed to elaborate, they usually pointed to some very concrete absences of jobs, of cash, of land, of infrastructure, of opportunities for business and education, and ultimately of an understanding about whether the situation is ever going to change. Although Marhabo's account similarly portrayed migration as an inevitability, an act of despair against the lack of economic opportunities, her nothingness had an extra layer. To understand the multi-layered constitution of this nothingness, it is necessary to turn to the experiences of living and imagining one's present and future in a place which has been constituted and is being reconstituted through different past and present mobile trajectories. Nothingness emerged in the context of post-socialist economic restructuring, the withdrawal of the welfare state, the remaking of past socialities, and the recalibrating of physical space in Tajikistan. It was profoundly constituted by the disjuncture between the pressing need to bear the burden of meeting one's life projects under the scrutinizing gaze of the community and the loss of capacity to do so staying in place. And I will I just want you to have a look at the pictures. I will explain a little bit later about the material outlook of the village, but on the top you can see this beautiful kind of Soviet mosaic at the local factory, and down there you can see the factory, or what is left from that factory around which the whole village used to revolve. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. So I don't know the audience, so I'm going to give you a little bit of the context about Tajikistan and migration from Tajikistan, although forgive me if you already know this. So over the past 30 years, labor migration to Russian cities has become a well-trodden path, bridging this disjuncture, with the economy of Tajikistan becoming heavily reliant on migrant remittances as the source of poverty reduction and development. The estimate is that out of the population of 10 million, approximately 10 million people, there are around 1.5 million Tajikistani nationals in Russia. Met Institute, also, obviously these figures are quite difficult to be precise with, and they are politically manipulated, but we can talk about it during discussion. Met Institute almost 85% of the migration flow. And migration is a family project tied to certain obligations and responsibilities within family hierarchies. It implies the circulation of family members, which involves a collective decision about who stays and who goes. Imagining the migration as a short-term project for earning money for a particular ritual event or a big purchase, many migrants find themselves caught up in a vicious cycle of new family needs and new projects constantly appearing. As a result, although they perceive their presence in Russia as temporary, in fact, many of them spend their whole working lives there, hoping to eventually be able to return to Tajikistan after their retirement. The majority of migrants in Russia are pushed to engage in unqualified labor because their education, skills, and qualifications remain irrelevant for the Russian labor market. Satisfying the Russian labor market's need for cheap labor of guest workers, most of them are employed often informally, in prestige state construction projects, for instance, as the Football World Cup back in 2018, and in small businesses. So I will not be talking much about Russian migration regime today. We can discuss it at Q&A. It's a huge separate topic, But I would just say that the visa-free regime facilitates the transnational lifestyles and the high level of circulation between Tajikistan and Russia. Yet overcoming various bureaucratic hurdles to become fully documented once in Russia is very difficult. Thus, many people end up being so-called illegal on various levels, and they become deportable. And this story is not new. Russian migration regime has many similarities to other migration regimes, like in Europe, the UK, here as well. And the main difference is that Russia made its citizenship regime quite liberal, which attracts new citizens mostly from former Soviet republics. And in my book, I have a chapter on that. And Mariana also works on citizenship. So this is also an interesting angle to look at, but I decided to choose something else today. However, this temporary fixed migration offers goes beyond the questions of material provisions of livelihoods. Let's get back to Marhaba. Marhaba's emphasis on the imperative to engage in major projects steering a normative life course in a full and timely manner, getting married, building a house, giving birth, and so on, revealed how crucial they are for one's social becoming, yet how immensely burdensome they have come to be experienced over the past decades. It is through the successful fulfillment of these projects and participating in community sociality that one achieves and sustains the status of being a good person, or хороший человек in Russian. By providing an economic opportunity to meet these demands, migration opens up a path to moral personhood. However, it simultaneously causes tensions in local ideas about what it means to be a good person and ultimately what it means to have a good life, зиндагии хуб in Tajik, or хорошая жизнь in Russian. On the one hand, Marhaba located migration decisions in the extremely burdensome character of life projects that need to be made visible for the community through everyday performances of care and respect and organizing expensive ritual events with the distribution of foods and gifts. On the other hand, although she appreciated the greater autonomy one could have in Russia, she was cautious of the possible flip side of this. The statement that no one cares in Russia can be equally interpreted as a lack of due care and respect detrimental to one's personhood. So attention to the lived experiences of such contradictions with which people grapple on the everyday basis allows me in my book to situate analysis of migration in the space between the paradox and the good life. One must go to Russia to become recognized as a fully fledged person by one's community, while at the same time going to Russia can undermine the very foundations of their personhood. And this is the master paradox that my research revealed. It points to the scope and complexity of my interlocutor's embeddedness within the largely unequal relations of interdependence on different scales, Russia's and Tajikistan's economies, places, ideas, and bodies. And the chapters in my book explore these, how people's attempt to solve this paradox, which are at the core of the process of what I call locating the good life. And I'm going to tell you a few words about that. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, to locate has a few distinct meanings. First, to find out where something can be obtained. Second, to set a scene, a story in a particular location. And third, to place an idea, for instance, within a particular context. All of these three meanings are significant to the story this book tells. While trying to figure out where they could find resources to maintain their families' and communities' well-being, my interlocutor's ideas of what exactly constituted the good life were placed in a different context within a concrete geographical location. Physically located in a different setting and locating their ideas and practices in a different social context pushed them to reflect on differences in value regimes, moral experience, and practice in Russia and Tajikistan. This revealed the presence of ongoing moral judgment, reasoning, and deliberation, processes which are central for human ethical life manifest in people's strivings for the good. Analyzing how my interlocutors are locating the good life across several domains, by trying to overcome tensions and moral dilemmas, I explore the complex relationship between migration, the pursuit of the good life, and people's projects of self-fashioning. And in my book, I ask several questions. How are migration decisions in rural Tajikistan bound up with specific categories of person that people are trying to inhabit? What forms of self-fashioning do they engage with? How are their efforts to achieve and sustain a desired personhood conditioned by structural forces of spatial and social transformation of Tajikistan after independence? And what tensions does this produce and how do people overcome them? So providing some answers to these questions by attending ethnographically to the areas where these tensions play out, I argue that in Tajikistan, migration has become inherent to the very project of becoming a fully fledged person. As such, it is as much a project of navigating moral personhood as it is a quest for economic resources enabling people to enact their ideas about the good life. And in my today's talk, I chose to illustrate this relationship ethnographically by attending to the experiences of my interlocutors as they try to cultivate themselves as modern subjects. But before I unpack this, I would like to give you some more kind of theoretical context of my book. Yes. So my theoretical take on in this book comes from several dissatisfactions. The first one is economic determinism, which is especially prevalent when we talk about one of the most remittance-dependent countries in the world, with excess labor resources and a steadily growing young population. The second one is a tendency to highlight these themes falling within the suffering slot, and I will explain a little bit later. Both tend to reduce people's experiences and subjectivities to their documentary or economic status and locate migration decisions within abstract demographic and economic processes. To be clear, I do not deny economic necessity as a very important structural factor shaping migration flows from Tajikistan and elsewhere. If you ask any person in the region why they migrated, they're most likely to tell you majbur, which means I had to. It's a declaration of necessity. Most studies take this necessity for granted, assuming that this is a direct outcome of insufficient growth, insufficient economic growth, meeting rapidly growing populations. In her work, Madeline Reeves made the most compelling case of how an account of labor migration from Central Asia in terms of economic necessity is only the start, should only be the start of an explanation for the scope, speed, and dynamics in this process, rather than its end point. However, we see the same logics reproduced again and again, and little concern given to people's lived experiences. So the more time I spent sharing everyday experiences with my interlocutors, the more evident it became to me that majburi, necessity, could not be captured in terms of material hardship only. In my work, I explore people's claims about the necessity of migration in their totality. I ask how is this sense of necessity and urgency of going to Russia is bound up with people's projects of self-fashioning. And in my analysis, I took inspiration from recent Alice Elliott's study of migration in Morocco. She argues that despite all the attention the topic of migration regularly receives in public and academic debates, understanding what migration actually is and is imagined to be for those involved in the national and transnational movements that shape it is usually not a priority. Focusing on the causes, effects, risks, and costs of migration, the common assumption is that the researcher, the researched, and the reader share an understanding of what migration means experientially and conceptually in the first place. We can say that a similar epistemological assumption emerges in migration studies when it comes to the questions of the good life. Foregrounding the universal suffering subject in migration research has resulted in the assumption that people in the global south can travel only out of poverty, desperation, and fear. Migration research often glosses over the fact that strivings for the good, meaningful life is precisely what keeps people going, despite punitive migration regimes, state violence, and xenophobia. Approached through the analytic of desperation, the good life becomes reduced to the universalist standard of generic economic well-being, modeled after the ideals of late capitalism. To decenter our analytical attention away from push-pull models, Alicia Elliott makes a move that reframes the relationship between migration and life from one of causation to one of co-constitution, in which the focus of ethnographic and conceptual labor lies in tracing how migration emerges through life. So pushing the decentering of conceptual imagination of migration further, in my book, I aim to explore the co-constitution of migration and personhood, with a particular focus on migration emerging through people's projects of self-fashioning. And I show how people's active attempts to carve out their own projects of the good life are intimately linked with the imagination of migration. However, it is not just about imaginaries of distant places of generic betterness. The conceptions of the good life are deeply rooted in moral valuations. In other words, the question of where the life is good is inseparable from the question of how life is to be lived. And now I just want to give you a little bit more context about my field site, and we're approaching to the kind of thematic, less theoretical part of my talk. So in 2017, 2019, I conducted 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork with migrants and their families, mostly in the post-industrial rural area of northern Tajikistan in the Sud province. My field site is located in the Fergana Valley, very close to the border with Uzbekistan, which was shut down since the late 1990s, interrupting kinship ties and economic activities. The border reopened in March 2018. I was there at the ceremonial event, but it was not clear yet how the economic, social, and kinship ties will reconstitute in the region. The population of that region is ethnically and linguistically mixed. People identify as Uzbek, Tajik, Tatar, and all sorts of Aralash, which means mixed in Tajik. The post-World War II Soviet development policies transformed the economic organization of Soviet Central Asia. This led to massive population shifts and change in the social and cultural dynamics of local places. These population shifts were accompanied by changes in language repertoires and the emergence of a particular hierarchy of languages, with Russian at the top. In the 1950s, a major extractive industry was built in this area. Such an ambitious project mobilized human resources with different kinds of expertise. Many of the newcomers were Russian-speaking specialists and young graduates from different parts of the Soviet Union. The construction of the factory was finished by 1956. But a new place on the map grew out of this infrastructural project. It was assigned the status of Поселок городского типа, or urban type settlement, and named Mekhnat, labor, after the idea of culturally and ethnically diverse socialist labor. I chose to choose a pseudonym for the place, so Mekhnat is a pseudonym, but the real name of the place pretty much reflects the same idea of kind of cultural and ethnic diversity. The factory soon became the provider of work and welfare for a large part of the local population. This role was connected to the gradually emerging material and social infrastructure, so a comprehensive school, a kindergarten, a library, public bath, and a house of culture you can see on the top. And on the bottom, you can see the actually unfinished Soviet apartment blocks. They are still inhabited, but there is no infrastructure there, so people tend to move out if they can. Mekhnat's effective connections with other parts of the Soviet Union were effectively sustained through multiple trajectories of people and things. The goods produced at the local factory was shipped all the way to Moscow, and the local youth traveled to the western part of the USSR for education and military service, not just the western, all over. This contributed to a shaping of the imaginary of Mekhnat as a distinct place of modernity, a civilized place, inhabited by the people who, to borrow Julie McBride's words, believed that they were modern This place fostered specific forms of interethnic sociality mediated through the Russian language, which had come to be seen as an organic part of this modernity. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Mekhnat's modernity was put in question by the economic restructuring and civil war. And that's when the migration I'm looking at comes in the picture. It began in the mid-1990s and really took off in Mekhnat in the early 2000s. And in my book, I show that this contemporary migration to Russia is an attempt to create continuity and maintain the imaginary of Mekhnat as a place of modernity. Given the embeddedness of mobility in the making of a modern place, as people found themselves in a situation of economic and political decline and infrastructural failure, they turned to the same means by which this contested modernity was produced in the first place. And I'm going to talk now a little bit more about how I understand modernity. Obviously, we do not take it literally. So anthropologists of migration have shown that in many places an increase in global connectivity has marked a global connection of interdependence between old and emerging metropolitan centers and their suburbs outside their national territories. For instance, Samuli Shirke argues that Egyptian villages were turned into the suburbs of the Gulf through massive labor migration. Such situation throws entire communities into existence in the shine of metropolis and causes an acute feeling of living in the periphery. Accounts of mobility in different parts of the world show that migration projects are saturated with images of high consumerist modernity associated with the West. These images are so powerful that they often obscure real migrant experiences for those who stay put. Tajikistani's migration to Russia presents an intriguing case to analyze what happens in places where, again, to borrow Julie McBrien's words, people see themselves as having been and as in need of becoming modern. The notions of tradition and modernity have long been key tropes that have dominated the historical and political imagination of the peripheries, such as Central Asia. Anthropological scholarship has critically interrogated the concept of modernity beyond the assumptions of classical modernization theory, which understands modernity as a certain chronological period with a number of associated institutional forms. In my work, I built on Tilma Stavlansky's work, and he looked at how people integrate, assimilate, and reject particular fragments deriving from various projects of modernity in everyday interactions. In this reading, the pieces of classical modernization theory and local concepts that inform people's everyday practical use of the category of modernity are considered as entangling and equally important. Thus, rather than using modernity as a category of analysis, he suggests paying attention to the local methods of modernity that order people's worlds and transform social interactions. So I treat modernity as an ethnographic term operating through a number of local concepts in everyday practical use. These concepts are rooted in particular local experiences of socialist modernity, but they are also constantly being transformed in light of increasing global connections. Migration to Russia pushes people to locate themselves vis-à-vis Russia's own attempt to appear as a modern migrant receiving state. As a result, they are forced to rethink their projects of modernity, incorporating, transforming, or rejecting new and already existing elements. The local idiom of modernity consists of a range of adjectives. They are intimately linked with the Soviet modernization project, the project that sought to turn locals into subjects with the capacity to become a new cultured man, культурный человек. So in my work, I consider, like what I encountered in the field, three terms my interlocutors often drew upon in our conversations. Современный, modern, цивилизованный, civilized, and культурный, cultured. And I will show how the last one, cultured, культурный человек, worked in my ethnographic material. But it is also very important to emphasize that modernity is a relational category that is used to distinguish different places and people within time and space and organize them hierarchically. Soviet cultural policy was premised upon a hierarchy of ethnic groups organized around the degree of their development. So-called European nationalities, Russians, Ukrainians, Estonians, and others, were positioned at the top, and Central Asians at the opposite pole of the continuum, at that star layer, or backwards. It's not hard to notice the racial contours of these hierarchies too, and some scholars argue that the Soviet category of ethnicity worked in a very similar way as the category of race. Tajiks in these hierarchies were considered by Soviet ethnographers and demographers as especially traditionalist, too attached to their kinship groups and land, and therefore highly immobile. It came as a genuine surprise to many social scholars in Russia that with the post-Soviet economic transformations in the region, a huge share of Tajikistan's population got involved in movements so fast. But these distinctions were never completely erased. Yet towards the end of the period of developed socialism, the inhabitants of northern Tajikistan, with its growing economy and functioning welfare state, seemed to have little doubt about their own modernity. They believed that, when I was there, they believed that the post-Soviet upheavals and a violent civil war set back the development of the country for decades, and now they had to catch up on their development. At the same time, the new large-scale exposure to the violent Russian modernity through experiences of migration to contemporary Russian cities further contributes to challenging people's understanding of themselves as modern. It is within this specific historical context and shifting economic and social realities in opposition to temporal and spatial others that people are trying to find an answer to a crucial question of whether they are still современные or дикие, so modern or wild, savage. On one of the first days after my arrival, my temporary host, a Russian teacher, happily announced that she had already found a place for me. I would move in not just with an ordinary family, but the family of a singer. Soon enough, driven by a strong desire to improve his Russian, Farhod, a handsome man in his early 40s with a pleasant voice, appeared on my doorstep. He was accompanied by his nephew, who had graduated from a Russian medium class. Farhod was sure that his Russian was too bad for me to be able to understand him, so he could not open his mouth from embarrassment, instead letting his nephew explain his proposition. He wanted me to move in with his family to teach them how to speak Russian without an accent. It was not the kind of classic migrant subject my researcher's imagination was focused on at the beginning of my fieldwork. However, I decided to give it a chance and to get the feel of what it means to be the one who does not go to Russia in the community, especially for a man. Farhod's project to transform himself into a культурный человек unfolded across several areas. Mastering the Russian language and maintaining a certainly bodily presence in the community are the areas that I explore in my chapter 2, but I'm not going to talk about all of it, of course, because we don't have that much time. During the early Soviet period, kultura came to constitute one of the central spiritual values of Soviet civilization. It was presented as a kind of value that could be accumulated, purposefully transferred to, and acquired by wider groups of the population. One could be seen as having more or less of it, and kulturность, cultureness, could be purposefully cultivated. On the personal level, kulturность was achieved through the reshaping of certain bodily practices and external features of an individual. These interconnected practices stretched from the private domain to the work of life of individuals and were related to the spheres of dress and appearance, personal hygiene, domestic material environment, manner of speaking, and leisure practices. Farhod invested a lot of hope into my almost year-long stay at his house. He constantly urged his family to speak Russian with me and among themselves too. When I had my Tajik lessons, Farhod insisted that we should all study together. This turned the living room into a study centered around the table, on tahta, a small short-legged table. And our long, boring winter evenings became filled with fun and joy, and we constantly exchanged puns, wordplay, and jokes. Farhod's body and the bodies of his family was another side where the constant work of crafting a modern self was done. Farhod paid a lot of attention to his and his family's looks, moves, and places where they were to be seen by the scrutinizing gaze of neighbors. Every departure from the intimate space of his house was preceded by a lot of work for the whole family. His wife would iron his shirt, polish his shoes, and give him a fresh handkerchief. The children would wash his old Mercedes. He would shave, generously apply cologne and hand cream, put on a suit for work or jeans, and a perfectly ironed shirt and sunglasses. Only then did he feel prepared to subject himself to people's gazes. Farhod's self-presentation efforts also stretched to the bodies of his family members. He would not allow his wife or daughters to dress in a tasteless or rural manner, although they lived in a kishlak, in a village. Such as wearing a dressing gown and domestic sleepers in the town, as many local women certainly did, because it's comfortable. If the weather was not too hot, every time we went to the town, the girls wore kurtaya Rus, or Russian dress, and mid-length dress with black or transparent tights, instead of the traditional colorful kurtaya Tajiki Tajik dresses, and polished shoes instead of comfy sleepers. And in the pictures you can see, like, I just put a few shots from Farhod's music videos. Like on the top, he's performing as like really modern man. Like on the bottom, he is more kind of adhering to trying to kind of adhere to the image of traditional Tajik singer, although modernized as well. Farhod has been to Russia twice. Once in 2002, when he joined his elder brothers to earn some money for circumcision feast for their newborn sons, and in 2010, after his father's long-term illness and death, which left his family in debt. He was a rare example of a man who did not get caught up in the perpetual cycles of migration and return at that point, because when I left, their whole family moved to Russia, and they're still there. I saw them for the first time in 5 years back in Tajikistan last summer. So similarly to other global north countries, in Russian public discourse, migration is mostly portrayed as a security problem. It is discursively linked to a lack of integration, rising crime rates, the proliferation of corruption and informality. A typical migrant is represented as an illiterate, unsophisticated, unskilled young man from rural Central Asia with a poor knowledge of Russian and who struggles to adapt to an urban civilized lifestyle. Such developments in public discourse normalize the position of migrants as homo laborans, a temporal, disposable, cheap labor force, who can contribute to the creation of Russian modernity, but can never become a part of it. And here on this slide, I just put some pictures from a very controversial brochure that was produced, I think, in St. Petersburg around 2010, maybe a little bit earlier. And in that brochure, and it's a typical practice of the Russian state to constantly try to educate migrants through different kind of brochures, small books or courses like how to behave. So in this one, migrant workers, as you can see, are portrayed as tools, and local people, Russians, are portrayed as people, right? So and they're kind of pestering migrants, saying like, "Помните, дома ваши здоровыми, you have to take care of your health," you know. And back then, it caused a lot of controversy. I'm not sure how it would be received now. An abrupt transition from being a well-known singer in his motherland to a racialized and qualified migrant worker in St. Petersburg made Farhod deeply unhappy. He summarized his experiences in our interview. I'm going to read, but you can also read there. "I felt so miserable in Russia. I slept with 10 people on the floor in one room. There was a constant queue to the bathroom. Somebody had smelly socks. I couldn't sleep at night because of bedbugs bites, and then I had to wake up at 5 in the morning and go to work. We came back home, and while we were cooking, washing dishes, and doing laundry, female job usually, it already turned 12 at night. Then again, you go to bed. You can't fall asleep and have to wake up at 5. Then you work in a closed space without daylight, without proper ventilation. It's dusty and noisy. They don't provide you with any mask. You get in the morning and get out at 10 p.m. when it's already dark outside, with a 5-minute lunch break. If you take more time, the Russians start to reproach us that we don't work properly, but they sit as long as they want. Then you hardly manage to eat and sleep and have to go to work again. Work flat, work flat, work flat. All the same every day. You don't feel like a human being. I got so annoyed with such a schedule, I even started to smoke there. I don't want such a life. Я творческий человек. I'm a creative man. I want to sing my songs. I want to relax, to walk around. Who will I be there? Just a laborer. That's why when my classmates call me, I'm not interested. I saw how they live there, but here they behave like kings. They build these houses to show off, but who are they? Just mardikory, slaves in Russia. Mardikory is like a Central Asian word for a daily laborer. Not willing to fall into the category of slave himself, Farhod tried to maintain his previous ways of being. Taking advantage of being in St. Petersburg, the cultural capital of Russia, they visited tourist places and went to museums. Russian discourses on migration contribute to the shaping of public images of migrants in Tajikistan too. Being appointed as representatives of the Tajik nation, migrants are burdened with the responsibility of showing its proper face. Should they not fit in the category of an ideal migrant, they are considered to be shameful citizens in need of education in the Russian language, laws, and proper models of behavior. I encountered similar criticism of migrants in the field in Tajikistan. Although everyone knew that, in Farhod's words, Россия не курорт, Russia is not a resort, they still criticized migrants for their lifestyle, which left little space for the articulation of their cultureness. Farhod was trying hard to reject the migrant identity and articulate his modernity. However, his attempts to act as a kulturный человек was so much more expensive than in Tajikistan that his family started to question his ability to remit money. Soon his life became subordinated to the grueling rhythm of his work schedule and was reduced to the overcrowded apartment and the closed dusty room at the factory. Undesired and illegalized, migrants are expected to fit into shared expectations of what migrants in Russia are for, which is doing the jobs that locals do not want, and what niches they ought to occupy. Thus, it was virtually impossible for Farhod to articulate his kulturness under such conditions. Being in the midst of Russian modernity, he was constantly denied his own. So as people struggle to make sense of their perceived modern past and less modern present, migration to Russia has become not just a means to an economic end, but a project of becoming subjects with the capacity to be modern. I have approached modernity as a category constituted through the multitude of creative projects of individual and collective self-fashioning. These projects are not coherent, but are rather idiosyncratic, and they simultaneously draw on different historically grounded lexicons and imaginaries of what it means to be a modern person. In this talk, I focused on the socialist part of it, but that's not the full story. Yet these modes of self-fashioning are of little relevance for Russian society, as the Russian migration regime is rooted in the representation of nationals of Central Asian countries as unskilled migrant workers in need of being educated and prepared for work in Russian cities. Their presence on the territory of Russia is contingent on subordinating their aspirations for modernity to the physical prowess needed to construct modern life for the Russian middle class. Thus, my account points to one of the tragic paradoxes of this migration. Driven by economic and social upheavals of the post-Soviet period, migration in Tajikistan aims to fill the gap not only in family budgets, but also in people's sense of self. Yet how can this gap be closed when the Russian state prevents migrants from articulating their aspirations to position themselves as modern subjects? And if I have 5 minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to conclude briefly to make like a little bit more generic kind of conclusion. Making predictions remains an important part of the established modes of analysis and writing about migration. Yet the experts turn out to be constantly wrong in their predictions when it comes to the dynamics of migration in Tajikistan. One might think that the onset of Russia's violent invasion in Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions on the Russian economy would reverse or at least put this migration on hold. The risks of being drafted into the Russian army and sent to the front lines serving as a serious deterrent for young male migrant workers. However, that's how it was 2 years since the beginning of the war, now 3. Migrant workers keep arriving in Russian cities, and the mass process of acquiring Russian citizenship by Tajik nationals continues. Every time a major crisis hits, journalists, political analysts, and social scientists alike rush to predict a sharp decrease in the number of Central Asian migrant workers coming to Russia. It was the case in 2008 with the global financial crisis, in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and devaluation of the local currency, and in 2021 with the COVID-19 pandemic, worldwide lockdowns and border closures. However, every time migration flows seem to bounce back and people return to Russia after a short time spent in their countries of origin, their mobility facilitated by a visa-free migration regime. It seems to be the case with Russia's war in Ukraine too, despite the increase of violence towards migrants inside Russia and new existential risks of holding a Russian passport. The movement of Tajikistanis between their homeland and Russia remains relatively steady. Given the highly unequal nature of the relationship between Tajikistani migrant workers and the Russian state, this might sound like a paradox. However, it only becomes a paradox if one views migrants as rational subjects, extracted from complex, historically grounded relations of interdependence that shape people's social ties, subjectivities, and ideas about what constitutes the good life. In this book, I suggest that turning our ethnographic and conceptual gaze to people's imaginaries, subjectivities, and ethical struggles is productive for understanding that what migration is and what it does to people and places. Written from the vantage point of the place of origin of migration, rural Tajikistan, this book does not have the spectacle of state and societal violence towards migrants and new citizens in Russia. It rather takes it as an important context in which people navigate multiple dilemmas of how life is to be lived. This book also does not make any sensational predictions about the future of migration in the region. Yet I hope that by sending the reader on the intimate journey of my interlocutors who struggle to locate the good life between Tajikistan and Russia, this book will spark a different sort of conceptual imagination, going beyond the bounds of political economy and international relations and shed light on why, but more importantly, how this ambivalent relationship persists.
For a wonderful talk. I've been sort of following this project over many years and had a lot of time to reflect on, to read it in as words and reflect on and sit with her. But it's always a pleasure to go to another talk where you talk about your work. And I think it is really, I mean, you mentioned this at the end of your talk. It's something I've noticed many, many times, like around the time of the pandemic, around the time of the war, that a flurry of articles in the Guardian, and New York Times, and Western news outlets, that have headlines like Central Asian migrants turn their backs on Russia, or like, is this the end of Central Asia Russia migration, and blah blah blah. And it's interesting. And earlier to that too, all the different ruble crises that went on. And it's interesting how these sorts of predictions just have not come true. I mean, we really don't see this big decline in migration, certainly not from Tajikistan. And I think what a lot of these accounts with these journalists who write these articles fail, I mean, they're very geopolitically inflected too, of course, so there's all of that. But I think what they don't understand is just how embedded migration is as a life strategy since in the past 20 years, 25 years, in a place like Tajikistan, in a place like Kyrgyzstan, to some extent in Uzbekistan as well. And at this point, you know, how many people in Tajikistan have Russian citizenship, and they wouldn't even statistically be counted as migrants, even though they are experiencing it very well in that way. So it's, yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I have many comments and reflections, but I would love to open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Borisova.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, this is probably an overly broad question ultimately, but I wanted to ask about empire and post-empire as a frame for this story. You use the frame of modernity, and I think that's I think that's for perfectly understandable reasons. Particularly, as you said, because even in the Soviet period, Central Asians generally didn't see themselves as a colonized population. But I also think that the framing of modernity is not incompatible with a framing of modernity, right? Particularly when we're talking about hierarchical discourses of relative modernity. And as you said at the end, sort of both cultural and socioeconomic structures, which limit sort of people's self-fashioning as modern subjects. So even going back into the Soviet period, if you look at the work of a scholar like Jeff Sahadeo, we see this sort of migration as part of Soviet life in Central Asia. And it looks quite similar, of course, to migration in other empires or post-empires, which Sahadeo argues. So I'm just wondering, sort of thinking about this as an imperial or post-imperialist story, how can we understand these processes of like self-fashioning and sort of life cycles as being shaped by an imperial structure? Are the subjects post-colonial people? And if they are post-colonial people, what does that tell us about the post-colonial condition? It even struck me, I'll conclude here, this idea of necessity to self-fashion as modern speaks to a certain sort of imperial structure of who is lacking in modernity and who isn't. So just if you could address any part of that question that you're interested in.
Shall I answer or shall we put up more questions?
I think we can just go
Yeah,
back.
yeah, no, I thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very relevant one. The very honest answer for it would be that when I was finishing my book, empire was not as popular yet. You know, like, so I did not really, I was theorizing from the place of the experiences of my interlocutors, and I was trying to flesh out the inequalities and paradoxes, right, in my interlocutors and their subjecthood formed under conditions of the late socialism, but I didn't call it that way. But I think if you read my chapter 2, it could be very easily kind of read into that framework. I just did not see the need to use these categories at that point and go into this discussion. Was the Soviet Union empire or it wasn't the empire? Because there's a lot of it has been written and said, and I just didn't. I don't know. If anything, I see the contribution of this work into this framework because it's like a very close ethnographic reading of how actually of living people whose subjecthood is formed by these contradictions. And I guess my interlocutor desire to speak Russian without an accent, for instance, is one manifestation of that. And of course, we can call him a post-colonial subject, but I just didn't go that far because it didn't really matter to my book's argument how I call that. So I wanted to look at different domains and different facets of my interlocutor's personhood. But yeah, I can easily see how it can fit in that frame as well.
And I think like one thing that it's true that these discussions have become, it's certainly after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of talks about decolonizing the field of Russian, East European, Eurasian studies, however you're figuring it, Slavic studies, however. But one thing that I think a lot of people struggle with who deal with very like grounded research, you know, everyday people, is that these categories and these words aren't necessarily very commonly used by people, and it can feel sometimes and especially if you're interested in questions of post-coloniality and empire, which I am, for example, which many scholars of the region are, it can feel sometimes that you're maybe like putting categories into people's mouth, in a way, and then, is that really in line with decolonial scholarship? Like, it's a really tough question. And then, of course, you could get into the question of, a social scientist, humanities people were always using words to analyze our research subjects in ways that they don't necessarily read all the theory that we do or whatever, but it can create a lot of difficulty sometimes in like who should be telling the story, whose framework here is.
Yeah, also particularly look at it seriously, right? Like I know that there are like a lot of heated discussions now in Central Asian studies as well about decolonization, but I do not necessarily. I try to be as true to my material as I could, and I don't think we should kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's still important for people, even if like we don't want it to be important, and we prefer it for it not to be important, and like to. But it feels a little bit arrogant coming to them and saying like, "Hey, you're not decolonizing properly. Like, what are you doing? We're speaking Russian. Speak Tajik to me." So it's.
Sure.
Just a brief, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this sort of debate over whether the Soviet Union was an empire and what empire means in Central Asian studies, history, it's kind of played out, and I think there's not much left to be said. What I was really interested in your work and how you presented it is that, again, an alternative conceptual reading of it is, a question of, how one, is modern or behaves modern or self-fashions as a modern person. Another way of thinking about it would be ways of being imperial or and I'm not necessarily super committed to like one theoretical language or another, but I think exactly what was so interesting is the question of, ways of being and ways of fashioning and sort of concrete detail, rather than this sort of theoretical debate of, right, was it modernity, was it empire, when it, it could be both anyways. So I think that was, it's not necessarily that it has to be an imperial frame, but I think that approach to exactly the concrete details of how people live their lives.
Any other questions up here?
Yeah, which is, you spoke about how people are motivated by self-perception. But is there the sense also that somebody who speaks Russian without an accent and speaks it well also gains a higher status in that particular society? And is it a kind of social climbing mechanism too that's driving this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. And I write about it a little bit like in more detail in my chapter, because this speaking Russian without an accent, it actually, I think, does not come from a place of wanting to be more protected or more successful in Russia. Partly, only partly, but for Farhod, for instance, it was this kind of obsession with speaking Russian without an accent as being a part of a, in some ways, modernity in the past, because he associated himself with the modern urban Tajiks rather than like Russians. So he didn't want to become Russian. He wanted to be a Tajik from Dushanbe in a way, who enjoyed the cosmopolitan environment of the city in his youth, who went to university, Russian-speaking universities. The fact that he just never had an opportunity to do that. And also he reflects a lot about his failed education and his position in the family in relation to his brothers and sisters. He has 10 of them, and according to him, all of them are speak Russian better than he does, which is not necessarily the case, but because they kind of were socialized in the late Soviet time, and they went through the institutions of socialization in Russia. They went to Russian schools, they went to colleges and universities. For him, he wants to belong to that. He never had a chance to belong to that. So this is another part of this story.
Just a follow-up. Does it extend to wanting to be able to quote verses of Pushkin and that kind of thing, or is it just everyday conversation?
That's a good question. You never talked about Pushkin, no.
He does quote like Белое солнце пустыни.
Oh yeah, of course, like the colonial, yes,
Like
Soviet
Soviet
films,
films,
yes, Soviet films, yes.
Maybe more popular culture than
Yeah, not Pushkin, no.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting. So I really enjoyed the linguistic breakdown of the words they use to describe sort of modern contemporary culture. And how do they view tradition? Because it seems like that's quite a complicated thing that they split, where they're like, okay, traditional feasts and certain rituals are good and a great sign of who you are, but certain other parts of tradition are, you know, out of fashion or geeky or yeah.
It's very nice that you noticed, like, because I have another chapter on tradition, actually, but that revolves around the questions of recent regulations. The Tajik government imposed the regulations on tradition, in which they quite explicitly kind of try to establish what tradition is. And the paradox of it is, of course, that it's rooted in the Soviet understanding of tradition as something that can be quantified, that can be codified as well. Like, you know, this is tradition, this is not tradition. But it also needs to be made compatible with modernity. So, you know, like you need to limit, for instance, in the text of the law, they actually write that you need to limit your expenses to the weddings. Alternatively, you can take the money you saved and put them in a bank account for the future. So you need to have this kind of forward future, like future-oriented disposition. You need to be more modern, right, in a way. So yeah, and this is very. It was actually a very interesting and very complicated thing to think about modernity and tradition, because obviously it's very messy. But people do not. The thing is that yes, tradition is good, but what is tradition, right? So the tradition is, and there is this work of my colleagues, Judith Bayer and Peter Finke, who published a volume on practices of traditionalization. So instead of looking at tradition, they look at how tradition is contested, changeable, and effectively charged. And they talk about the practices rather than discourses, because the discourse has been analyzed before through, for instance, scholars who looked at state building and nation building practices, and they always appeal to tradition as something like old and authentic and rooted in like a long time ago, but that's not what actually tradition is in practice. And people also debate. So there's this law which prescribes them like what is tradition and what it should be like, and people who kind of try to figure out on the everyday level what tradition includes and what it doesn't include, because obviously I talk about marriage celebrations in that chapter, and they're so complex. You cannot, like, a law cannot outline every single thing. You know, we usually when people write about that law, they were like, oh yes, they limit the number of guests, they limit the number of hours you can celebrate, they limit the numbers of cars you can have in your wedding cortege. But that is very kind of loose framework, because weddings last for like 2 weeks, longer, and you cannot regulate every single detail. So people have to navigate in these new, very complicated conditions, how to adhere to tradition, not to disappoint your neighbors, and also not to break the law at the same time.
I think the whole tradition, modernity, like how these concepts overlap in ways that you wouldn't quite expect, it's quite noticeable in Central Asia. Definitely, you know, what are the modern ways of wearing traditional dress, for example, or what are the modern ways of celebrating traditional holidays? Because certainly, like a lot of contemporary Tajik conceptualizations of how to celebrate Nowruz, for example, with plentiful, like, you know, that's that on a table full of like all sorts of sweets and whatever, and bananas and things you didn't have in the Soviet Union. Like now it's seen as traditional, perhaps, but like, you know, in this very modern way. Any other questions?
I actually wanted to ask about the conflicts, or maybe the mutual inspiration between your research subjects' ideas of modernity, what they pursue in their everyday life, and what the state, the Tajik state, may promote as a type of modernity, which brings us again to these attempts of the state to regulate dress, weddings. From your experience in the fieldwork, is that something your research subjects perceived as a conflicting relation, that the state interferes and opposes their own understanding of modernity, or is it in line and the state and the individuals pursue a shared notion of modernity? That would be very interesting to hear if in your interviews, in your discussions, the state figures as either limitation to living a modern life or a facilitator of such a modern life?
That's a very good question. I think both in some ways. You know, they, sure, I should say it on recording. So there was this, I think when I was there, and things have changed, there was this perception that the state, although it's intrusive, it's authoritarian, but it's kind of absent, especially since I was doing research in the rural area. So I would not really say that the state was kind of the first frame of reference when my interlocutors thought about the daily struggles. I do remember though that, so yeah, I think the state materialized for them in the figure of like, you know, it's kind of a mechanism of, sorry, I remember like I was working in a local school and there was an English textbook in which you had this exercise where you need to match, you know, the word to the definition, and there was one, the government, and the right answer, the right match for them was like the system to control people. So, and the textbooks were produced by the local teachers or I don't know, academics or whatever. So it was not like the, yeah. And I think there's kind of a status quo in a way, like, you know, you don't touch us. We like, you know, you promised that you have to care for us as a state. You don't, so leave us to our own devices. So don't interfere. So people take care of themselves. And they also sometimes laugh that, like in Uzbekistan, the state is rich and people are poor. In Tajikistan, the state is poor and the people are rich because we are all migrants. You know, look. Farhod sometimes took me on a ride and he would point to these like fancy new houses. He's like, look, Tajikistan, we are very poor. We're so much struggling, kind of jokingly because they are. So yeah, so I would say that. State could figure as both. I think people also kind of engage selectively with these discourses. I remember, I didn't write about it, but now I remember that one of my interlocutors talked about this new initiative. At that point, they published this lookbook for women, how women should look like. And she's as a young divorced woman. She struggled, a lot of unwanted attention, and she worked as a school teacher. And the school's administration told them that they cannot wear trousers. And in that lookbook, actually, like there was a page in which women were portrayed in trousers, like in suit, like, you know, that's how a modern woman should look like. So she appealed to that book and saying like, why our administration does not allow us to wear trousers when even this like official Tajik kind of state-approved textbook shows us that like this is how a modern woman is acceptable to look like. So I think it's yeah, so I would say it's both.
Sorry. So years ago I did a brief intensive language course in Kazakhstan, and there was that same idea that like within an urban center there was a more sort of Russophone community and things like that. And you mentioned as well this idea of Pahom, what's it? Pahom, wanting to be essentially a sort of urban metropolitan elite kind of figure rather than necessarily a purely Russified figure. Like, did you have an opportunity to talk with certain kind of people in Dushanbe or in urban areas and see how they viewed Russian and self-Russification and stuff like that? To see how it sort of intersects with those modernity figures?
No. The short answer is no. And I think Tajikistan is very diverse. So even though like it's small, but you can see that like the north was more industrialized and more Russified, and then the Dushanbe, and then the everything else. Like there is the Badakhshan, which is also quite has a particular perception of itself as a modern place. So yeah, I did not, but I'm sure they like in Dushanbe. I had brief experiences in Dushanbe. I didn't do research there, but I encountered these like new pious people, for instance, right, for whom like dressing in a certain way, participating in Muslim consumption practices were important. I guess the role of the Russian language was was not the same for them, but I did not do research with them. Maybe Mariana can answer this question better than me because she did research in the South.
One thing that comes to mind actually and it's, I mean, of course, in Tajikistan, like in many parts of Central Asia, you have the rural, urban, the hierarchies that map on a lot of questions of diversification. I wouldn't say they're equivalent, but they have a lot of overlap. And one thing that's interesting about Tajikistan, in the Soviet period, Dushanbe, the capital, it was not majority Tajik. And the capital, in part because of this, was much more Russified than the urban, rural areas. And even the rural areas of Tajikistan were quite un-Russified. I think it's only about half people in the late Soviet period could speak Russian fluently in Tajikistan, maybe even less, like a third. And it's interesting because in the late Soviet period, and I'm talking like the last 2 years of the Soviet Union, there were two like nationalist groups or political movements that emerged from in Dushanbe. One was called Rastakhez, which means like uprising or revival. It can also mean the other Rubaru, face to face. And both of these groups really, one of their main focus was revival of Tajik culture and the Tajik language. But these groups, they were also very unsuccessful outside of urban areas, in part because rural people in Tajikistan, especially for people who didn't even speak Russian at all, this platform of, you know, we need to take back our language and take back our culture meant nothing to these people at all. It just did not. And it really shows how, you know, in the Soviet Union, in the late years, the urban and rural experiences were just so different. Especially concerning issues of Russification. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind, is certainly in the case of Tajikistan, that it's not entirely true to say that, you know, in the Soviet Union, people were so Russified and everything. I mean, in a lot of ways, rural people, it was after the Soviet Union collapsed, they really started going to Russia and having to actually think about learning Russian more and things like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting that they persistently, like, there are social, I saw some survey, which, I mean, it's quite difficult to conduct this kind of research in Tajikistan, but when I published a small chapter on language hierarchies in that place, and also my experiences of trying to learn Tajik and learning it like in a very particular context. And I think I found some survey that said that like persistently people claim that they need more language training. They want to be more proficient in Russian. And even like at that point when I was there, the president made this speech that a cultured person in Tajikistan, like an intelligent, right, like a cultured person should speak at least 3 languages. First of all, like our own language, they need to master like the literally like Arabic, Tajik, Russian, and English now. So I think that also kind of fits the conception of a Tajik educated person, that they are multilingual, they are not just like proficient in their own language.
This is kind of related to the last question and discussion, but I was interested in Mehna, the town, as a sort of a space, and how you think about it in the project. I mean, is it, try to think how to put this. I mean, do you see it, or did your interlocutors see it as an exceptional space, a sort of particularly Soviet, sort of this new industrialization space? Do you see it as typical? I mean, is that distinction really important to you? And maybe how did they talk about it?
It was important for them because they highlighted that this is like not a kishlak, it's a поселок, you know, поселок городского типа, an urban type settlement. So, and some of them claim that Mihnat was even more urban than the nearby town. More urban, more cultured, more civilized, and partly because a lot of Russian speakers lived there, and they had this particular culture of kind of interethnic mingling. They were nostalgic about going to a disco, watching films together, this kind of mixed gender socialization. And after that, and also write about that as a kind of the change in material space of the village, in the process of kind of fencing off. They actually talk about it, I think, as a metaphor as well, but that, you know, like we all used to be together, and after the collapse, people just put up these walls, like, you know, this traditional kind of mahala houses, like they put up these walls, and now we are all divided and sit alone in our homes. Before there was like stuff going on. Дружба народов. Well, they actually didn't use this. I don't remember that they used this kind of дружба народов, but there was this idiom of being all together, being kind of, yeah, all together and socializing together a lot, and now kind of being struggling, being apart. Yeah.
Any other questions that anybody has? Do we have any online questions? Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, and then give a thank once more, Elena, for being here and giving such a wonderful talk, and then it's really quite a pleasure to have you here.
And the library has a book, right?
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
It's already at the library? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it's also open
Online,
access,
yeah.
so,
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
yeah, it's open access.
Well, that's great.